There are moments in history that do not announce themselves with fanfare. They arrive quietly, in the form of a tired king sitting down a little too heavily in his chair, or a young couple walking into a room and immediately owning it without saying a single word. And then, slowly, people start to realize that what they are watching is not just a royal event. They are watching the future arrive early. That is exactly what happened when the world began to understand that King Charles III, the man who waited 73 years to wear the crown, was preparing to hand it forward. Not in scandal, not in crisis, but in a moment of dignity so deliberate, so carefully considered, that it would go down as one of the most significant decisions in the history of the British monarchy. To understand how this moment came to be, you have to go back to a February evening in 2024. The announcement was short. It was controlled. Buckingham Palace released a statement that used careful, measured language, the kind of language that royal communications teams deploy when they want to say something enormous without saying it loudly. King Charles III had been diagnosed with cancer. The type was not disclosed. The timeline was not discussed. The palace simply said that the king had commenced a schedule of regular treatments, and that he intended to continue working where his health allowed. Britain went quiet for a moment, and then the questions began. The diagnosis had come to light after Charles underwent a procedure to treat an enlarged prostate in January 2024. What the palace announced in February was something separate, a different form of cancer, one that had been detected during that earlier procedure. The public was not given specifics, and the palace made clear it would not be providing them. What followed was a period of intense national uncertainty, masked by official reassurances and measured royal appearances that told only part of the story. Yahoo! Catherine, Princess of Wales, had announced her own cancer diagnosis in March 2024, just 1 month after the king's announcement. She had been undergoing preventive chemotherapy, and she eventually confirmed in January 2026 that she had completed her treatment and was in remission. 2 members of the same royal family at the same time, fighting the same invisible war. It was the kind of thing that would have broken a lesser institution, and yet the palace held together, publicly at least. Beautiful. What very few people understood at the time was how deeply those 2 diagnoses would change the internal conversation about the future of the monarchy. Because when a king is sick and his heir's wife is also sick, the question of what comes next is no longer a distant theoretical. It becomes urgent. It becomes real. It becomes the thing that senior advisors and constitutional officials start discussing behind closed doors, carefully and very quietly. Charles had always been a man who understood duty. He had waited for the crown longer than any heir in British history. He had buried his mother, managed his complicated family, navigated the fallout from Harry and Meghan's departure, survived Andrew's deepening disgrace, and stepped into a role that was never going to be easy. And he had done all of it with a kind of quiet determination that earned him more respect than he had ever been given credit for. But cancer does not care about determination, and the body eventually starts to speak louder than the will. Through 2024 and into 2025, Charles maintained an active public schedule, arguably more active than his health warranted. He had remained stoic while returning to work amid his cancer battle, even returning to engagements shortly after experiencing side effects from treatment. From historic state visits to preparations for Trooping the Color, Charles kept moving. Insiders who saw him up close told a different story. Behind the smiles and the handshakes, the king was exhausted. The treatments were taking a toll that no official statement was willing to fully acknowledge. Yahoo! And yet, even in that exhaustion, something remarkable was happening. Because while Charles was working to stay visible, William and Catherine were quietly, systematically, being positioned to lead. Prince William and Kate Middleton were set to step into their roles as grantors of royal warrants in spring 2026, thanks to King Charles granting them those titles. To an outside observer, this might sound like a bureaucratic detail, a formality, a routine transfer of a minor administrative function. But anyone who understands how the British monarchy actually works knew immediately that this was anything but routine. The royal warrant system is one of the oldest mechanisms of monarchical power in existence. It is the formal channel through which the Crown endorses British companies and industries, through which the royal family signals its trust and its preferences to the nation. And historically, only the sovereign could grant those warrants. Wait. News. Charles himself had become a grantor back in 1980, while he was still Prince of Wales. But notably, the late Princess Diana never held the role, despite marrying him the very next year. The fact that both William and Catherine were now being elevated to this position together, while Charles was still king, was a statement that no one inside the palace was pretending was insignificant. GB knows. One well-placed insider put it plainly. This is a very significant step. It gives William and Kate real monarchical power earlier than usual and signals that they are being fast-tracked for the top job. Jubileecast. That phrase, fast-tracked, is the one that matters. It was not a word chosen carelessly. It reflected the reality of what was happening inside the palace. A man who had earned his crown but was now grappling with his body's limits, a son who was more than ready, and a system quietly beginning its most careful handover in modern history. By the time December 2025 arrived, Charles made an announcement that in any other context would have been received as good news. During a Channel 4 Stand Up to Cancer broadcast, Charles spoke directly to the nation. Today I am able to share with you the good news that thanks to early diagnosis, effective intervention, and adherence to doctors' orders, my own schedule of cancer treatment can be reduced in the new year. It was gracious. It was hopeful. And it was carefully worded in a way that left a very specific question unanswered. LAD Bible. Palace had found a way to keep answering the question without ever actually closing it. Better but never declared better. Reduced treatment, never remission. Back to full duties, never fully explained. The statement said his treatment would be reduced. It did not say he was healed. And the people who were watching closely, the constitutional experts, the royal correspondents, the insiders with access to the real conversations happening inside Buckingham Palace, understood the difference completely. Beautiful. 2026 arrived with a different energy than any year the monarchy had seen in a long time. There was something in the air, a shift that was difficult to define but impossible to ignore. The king was still on the throne. William and Catherine were still technically heirs, but the gravitational center of the monarchy had begun, almost imperceptibly, to move. And then came the night that made it undeniable. On the 18th of March 2026, St. George's Hall at Windsor Castle hosted the first major state banquet of the year, a formal dinner in honor of the President of Nigeria. These events are the monarchy's most visible display of sovereign power and hospitality. They are choreographed, ceremonial, and deeply symbolic, and what happened that evening was witnessed by everyone in the room. When William and Kate arrived at St. George's Hall that night, there was no question who commanded the room, and it was not the king. Prince William and Princess Catherine looked, by every account, every inch the future monarch and queen. The contrast with King Charles was impossible to ignore. William and Kate radiated confidence, youth, and charm, one insider said. Charles really struggled that night. He looked small, frail, and at one point almost slumped into his chair. He seemed so exhausted. Jubileecast. Those words did not come from a tabloid. They came from someone inside the room. And while Buckingham Palace did not officially address the account, the fact that no one denied it said everything. The images from that evening circulated across media worldwide. Side by side, the contrast was right there in plain sight. A king who had given everything he had to the crown, and the couple who were ready to carry it forward. Britain looked at those images and felt something it had not quite felt before. Not grief exactly, not anxiety, something quieter and heavier. The sense that a long chapter was nearing its final pages. What no one outside the palace fully understood yet was what was being discussed in the private meetings that followed. The conversations that had already begun between advisors, constitutional lawyers, senior courtiers, and the family itself, about what came next, and when and how. The British monarchy does not do anything suddenly. That is perhaps its greatest strength and its most confounding quality. It moves with the patience of an institution that has survived 900 years of wars, rebellions, divorces, and revolutions. It changes, sometimes dramatically, but it always changes slowly, deliberately, and with enormous attention to optics and precedent. Which is why, when things inside the palace started moving faster than usual in early 2026, the people who were watching closely understood that something had genuinely shifted. Palace officials had clarified that King Charles III was reducing his cancer treatment in 2026, but that his condition was not in remission, a distinction that underscored why his health was still described as precarious in some briefings. That language filtered into wider commentary about whether the current reign would be measured in decades or in a much shorter span, and it sharpened the focus on succession planning rather than long-term legacy projects. AOL. Behind closed doors, those who worked closest to the king were dealing with a reality that was far more complicated than any official statement conveyed. Charles was still engaged. He was still signing papers, still meeting with the Prime Minister, still attending to the constitutional duties that form the invisible backbone of the monarch's role. But his energy was not what it had been. His advisors had already, quietly, begun the process of restructuring his schedule, removing the longer, more physically demanding engagements, reducing the international travel, and allowing William to step into more spaces than he had ever formally occupied before. Beyond the symbolism, William and Kate's official workload was already being recalibrated for a future in which they would be the central figures of the monarchy. Reports noted that the Prince and Princess of Wales were taking on responsibilities that had evolved over the past 7 years, consolidating their position as the public face of the institution. AOL. This recalibration was not accidental. It was the result of careful, sustained planning between the king and his senior advisors, who understood that the question of succession was no longer abstract. It was a question with a timeline attached to it, a timeline that the health situation was quietly defining, even if no one inside the palace was saying so explicitly. And in the middle of all of this institutional maneuvering, there was a deeply human story unfolding. Charles had watched his son grow from a grieving boy who lost his mother in the most traumatic and public way imaginable into a man of genuine substance, capability, and character. The relationship between Charles and William had never been simple. It had been shaped by Diana's death, by the years when William was caught between two parents with competing narratives, by the tensions that inevitably arise between a king and his heir. But it had also deepened over time, in the way that relationships between fathers and sons sometimes do slowly and often wordlessly. According to sources close to the king, Charles freely admitted that he would be lost without Catherine. His Majesty depends upon her for advice about physical and emotional challenges, because she knows firsthand what it's like to fight this wretched disease and come out the other side, one insider said. The fact that Catherine had navigated her own cancer battle, had emerged from it in remission, and had done so with a composure and dignity that genuinely moved the nation. This had forged something between her and the king that went well beyond the formal relationship of monarch and daughter-in-law. AOL. Catherine's cancer journey had changed her in ways that were visible to anyone paying attention. She had always been composed, she had always been poised, but there was a new quality in her public appearances since her recovery, something quieter and more authoritative. A woman who had looked at her own mortality and made her peace with it, and who had come through the other side with a clarity about what mattered and what did not. The nation had noticed. The king had noticed. And inside the palace, there was a growing recognition that Catherine was not simply William's partner. She was, in her own right, a figure of enormous significance for the future of the institution. When the decision was made to name both William and Catherine as grantors of royal warrants, giving them the authority to officially endorse companies that supply goods and services to the royal household, their private secretary made the nature of the moment explicit. Their Royal Highnesses are delighted to be able to recognize and celebrate British industry, creativity, and skills through the granting of warrants, the statement said. GB News. Delighted was the official word, but the significance went far beyond delight. As one royal insider put it, the biggest sign that William and Kate are getting ready to reign is the royal warrants, which start shortly. Traditionally, only the monarch can grant them, but now, William and Kate will also become grantors of royal warrants, meaning they can officially endorse companies that supply them goods and services. This gives William and Kate real monarchical power earlier than usual and signals that they are being fast-tracked for the top job. New idea. Royal warrants, in the context of British constitutional history, represent something very specific. They are not merely a brand endorsement. They are a declaration of trust by the Crown. They signal that the holder of a warrant carries the confidence of the royal household. And now, for the first time in modern history, an heir and his wife would hold the power to grant those warrants themselves, not as surrogates for the sovereign, but in their own names, representing their own household. The message this sent through the royal establishment was clear and immediate. The transition had begun. Not dramatically, not with speeches or ceremonies, but in the quiet, methodical language of institutional change that the British monarchy has always preferred. Meanwhile, the public narrative was developing in ways that no palace press office could fully control. At state events, at formal dinners, at the appearances that drew the cameras and the crowds, people were watching William and Catherine with a new kind of attention. Not just admiration, something more specific. The attentiveness that people give to someone they know is about to take on something enormous. At the state banquet held in March 2026 in honor of Nigeria's president, William and Kate pulled off what observers described as a flawless, regal performance. Looking every inch the future king and queen, one report noted, they had arrived at St. George's Hall with the kind of effortless authority that is not taught, it is earned. The contrast couldn't be more obvious, one insider said. While William and Kate radiated confidence, youth, and charm, Charles struggled to keep pace with even his already reduced schedule. New idea. That sentence, that Charles was struggling to keep pace with his already reduced schedule, was significant. It was not the language of a man in the prime of his reign. It was the language of a transition in progress. The question that was beginning to circulate in earnest in parliamentary corridors, in newspaper offices, in the private conversations of people who understood how the British constitutional system worked, was not whether a change was coming. That question had already been answered, at least in the minds of those with access to the real picture. The question was how, and when, and what form it would take. Radar Online reported that the king was being considered as a candidate for abdication in favor of his son, amid his cancer battle. The challenge, commentators noted, was that abdication carries its own extraordinary constitutional weight. The British monarchy had only seen it happen voluntarily once in modern history, when Edward VII stepped aside in 1936. That abdication had been a scandal, a crisis, a rupture that had scarred the institution for generations. No one inside Buckingham Palace wanted anything that looked or felt like that. Whatever the transition looked like, it had to be orderly. It had to be dignified. It had to be something that protected the monarchy's standing rather than damaging it. Yahoo! And so the conversations continued, careful, deliberate, conducted in the language of loyalty and duty and constitutional precedent. Charles was not being forced out. He was not being pushed. He was a man who had given his entire life to an institution, and who was now, in the quiet hours when advisors had gone home, and the formal day was done, thinking very seriously about what it meant to love something enough to let it go. Insiders reported that courtiers had confirmed the king was struggling to keep up with his already pared-down roster of duties, and that this had led to an increase in urgent talks about what came next. Sources described a unanimous feeling in some circles that Charles must go out on a high, that whatever transition came should come at a moment of the king's choosing, not at a moment dictated by a health crisis that had spiraled beyond his control. New idea. Going out on a high. That phrase, according to those who heard it, captured something real about Charles's own thinking. He was 77 years old. He had waited his entire adult life to be king. He had carried the crown through extraordinary challenges, a global pandemic in the final years of his mother's reign, his own coronation, his son's departure, his health battle. And he had done all of it with a quiet, determined sense of purpose. The idea that he might choose the terms of his own transition, that he might be the one to make the decision, rather than having it made for him, was not a fantasy. It was, according to people close to the family, becoming a genuine possibility. William, for his part, was ready. He had always been ready in a technical sense, prepared for the role since childhood, trained and briefed and surrounded by advisors who had been helping him understand the weight of what was coming. But the readiness that was visible in 2026 was different. It was personal. It was earned. It was the readiness of a man who had watched his father fight cancer, who had sat with his wife through her own treatment, who had held his family together through years of public turbulence, and who had emerged with a clarity of purpose that his father recognized and trusted. William had been conducting investiture ceremonies, high-level receptions, and meetings on behalf of Charles. He had been stepping into spaces that had previously been reserved for the sovereign alone. And Catherine had been beside him for all of it, not as a supporting player, but as an equal partner in everything that was coming. New idea. The nation was watching. The world was watching. And inside the palace, the conversations were getting closer and closer to a decision that would reshape the British monarchy for a generation. There is a particular kind of courage that does not get enough recognition. Not the courage of battle, or the courage of public confrontation, or even the courage of standing up for something when the world tells you to sit down, but the courage of release. The courage of a man who has held something precious for a very long time, who has shaped his entire existence around the holding of it, and who then looks at the thing he loves and says, "It is time for someone else to carry this forward." That is the courage that the world was beginning to understand in the spring of 2026, when the conversations happening inside Buckingham Palace were no longer just about managing a king's health schedule. They were about the future of a 1,000-year-old institution, and the man at the center of it was making the most important decision of his life. The British public had grown accustomed, over the previous 2 years, to receiving information about King Charles in careful, measured doses. Palace had never confirmed the specific type of cancer he had. It had never provided a detailed prognosis. It had managed the public narrative with a precision that was almost architectural, releasing enough to keep people informed, withholding enough to protect the king's dignity and the institution's stability. The honest summary, as one medical correspondent put it, was this: better but never declared better, reduced treatment, never remission, back to full duties, never fully explained. Beautiful. But by mid-2026, that careful architecture was under pressure from the reality that was becoming harder to conceal. The king's public appearances were fewer. The engagements he did carry out were shorter. The visible signs of exhaustion that insiders had noticed at private events were beginning to appear in public photographs. A heaviness in his movement, a pallor that careful lighting could not entirely disguise, a quality of effortfulness in moments that a well man would not notice at all. Courtiers who worked closely with the king were confirming, in private conversations with trusted reporters, that Charles was finding some of his longer occasions more tedious than ever. He was more fragile than he let on, and the toll of his cancer treatment had not gone unnoticed by those around him. New idea. The word that was starting to appear in briefings, not in official statements, but in the conversations that happen in corridors and over confidential lunches between palace officials and senior journalists, was abdication. It was not a word anyone used casually. In the modern British context, that word carried the weight of Edward VII, of crisis, of a moment in 1936 that the royal family had spent decades trying to put behind them. Using it now, in relation to a beloved, duty-bound king who had done everything right, required a very different framing. This was not the abdication of a man fleeing responsibility. This was the contemplated, principled withdrawal of a sovereign who understood that his legacy would be better protected by a graceful transition than by an indefinite clinging to power that his body was increasingly reluctant to support. Sources close to the palace said there was a unanimous feeling among some of Charles's most trusted advisors that he must go out on a high. They identified a potential window, sometime in mid-June 2026, shortly after Trooping the Color, as a moment of symbolic and practical significance. What could be better than after the king's birthday parade for him to finally bow out? One source said. New idea. Trooping the Color, the king's birthday parade, it was, if you thought about it, the perfect moment, a celebration of the reign. A display of military pageantry and national pride, with the entire royal family on the Buckingham Palace balcony, with the crowds below and the cameras carrying the image around the world. And then, quietly, decisively, a decision that would change everything. Whether that specific timeline was the one that Charles himself was considering, no one outside a very small circle of advisors could say with certainty. But the fact that the conversation had reached this level of specificity, that people close to the palace were naming dates and windows and occasions, told its own story about where things stood. William, meanwhile, was carrying the weight of all of this with a public composure that those who knew him said masked an enormous amount of private emotion. He had never wanted his father to be sick. He had never wanted the crown to come to him through illness. He had imagined, in whatever private way princes imagine their futures, that the transition would be different, calmer, more gradual, shaped by age rather than by disease. But life inside the royal family had long since taught William that the institution does not yield to personal preferences. You prepare for what comes, and then you meet it. And he had prepared. He had been conducting investiture ceremonies and high-level receptions on behalf of his father. He had taken on meetings that would previously have been handled at the sovereign level. He and Catherine had demonstrated, repeatedly and in public, that they were not simply waiting in the wings. They were already governing in everything but name. New idea. Catherine's role in all of this deserves particular attention, because it was in many ways the most quietly transformative element of the entire story. She had entered the royal family in 2011 as a young woman from a middle-class background, and she had spent years navigating the extraordinary demands of life as a senior royal with a grace that earned her enormous public affection. But she had never been the story's center. She had always been, in the institutional sense, an adjunct to William's narrative. That had changed. Her cancer diagnosis, her treatment, her recovery, and the way she had managed all of it, with controlled public disclosure, with evident personal courage, and ultimately with a transparency about her vulnerability that the public responded to with a depth of feeling that surprised even the palace, had transformed how Britain saw her. One source close to the king said that Charles freely admits he'd be lost without Kate, and that he depends on her for perspective on the physical and emotional realities of living with cancer, because she knows firsthand what it means to fight the disease and come out the other side. AOL, that was not a small thing. The King of England leaning on his daughter-in-law for counsel about one of the most private and terrifying experiences of his life. It spoke to a bond that the formal language of royal relationships does not usually capture. Something genuinely familial, genuinely human, between two people who had both stared at the same darkness and found their way through it. And it spoke to something else, too. It spoke to what Catherine would bring to the role that was coming for her, not just as a queen consort in the ceremonial sense, but as a genuine partner in the governance of an institution at a pivotal moment in its history. She was not going to be a passive presence. She was going to be a force. Reports from early 2026 described how Catherine's influence was growing, with sources detailing the new roles she and William were taking on and explaining what would change for the couple going forward. Those accounts described them consolidating their position as the public face of the monarchy, in a way that went well beyond the traditional prince and princess of Wales brief. AOL, the constitutional reality of what was unfolding was also being processed by the political establishment. The relationship between the British monarchy and the government is one of the most carefully calibrated dynamics in the country's entire governance structure. The monarch does not interfere in politics. The Prime Minister does not interfere in royal succession. But the two institutions exist in a constant, intimate proximity, and when one faces a moment of potential transformation, the other is always watching very carefully. Senior members of the government understood what was coming. They had been briefed, not in detail, not with timelines, but in the way that constitutional systems communicate across their boundaries when something significant is approaching. The message was clear. The monarchy was preparing for a transition, and that transition would be managed carefully and with full respect for the constitutional framework that governed it. For the British public, the emotional dimension of the moment was complex in ways that were difficult to articulate cleanly. Charles had not been the most popular royal figure of his generation. His decades-long affair with Camilla, conducted while his marriage to Diana was still officially intact, had never been entirely forgiven by a significant portion of the public. His relationship with Harry had become a source of ongoing pain and tension that played out in ways that felt, to many ordinary people, both deeply personal and utterly unrelatable. He had always carried the shadow of his mother's reign, a reign so long and so beloved that it had defined the public's understanding of what a monarch was supposed to be, and against which Charles, inevitably and perhaps unfairly, was always being measured. But there had also been, over the course of his reign, a growing recognition of something genuine about Charles. His lifelong commitment to environmental causes, decades before they became mainstream political concerns. His passion for architecture, for traditional craftsmanship, for the kind of connection to land and history and community that modernization was steadily eroding. His evident courage in facing his illness with dignity and continuing to work through the exhaustion and the side effects and the uncertainty. These things had not transformed him into the icon his mother had been, but they had earned him something more durable than popularity: respect. And now, as the possibility of a historic decision began to take shape, not as rumor, not as speculation, but as a real consideration being actively managed inside the palace, there was a quality of tenderness in the public conversation that would have been difficult to predict even a year earlier. People who had never particularly warmed to Charles found themselves moved by the image of a 77-year-old man, still fighting his illness, still showing up, still discharging his duties with everything he had. And now, possibly, contemplating the most selfless thing a king can do. The most selfless thing a king can do in the modern era is recognize that the crown is not his. It never was. It belongs to the institution, to the people, to the future. And a king who understands that, who can look beyond his own reign and ask not what the crown has given him, but what he can give the crown, is a king who has earned his place in history. The transition of power, whenever it came, and in whatever form it took, would invite profound reflection on the future of the British monarchy. With a new generation at the helm, there would be a delicate balance to strike between honoring tradition and embracing the kind of modernity that a changing world demands. The popularity of William and Catherine, and the sense that their approach to royal life could bridge the distance between the institution and younger generations, was a central part of that hope. Ergli, William was 43 years old. Catherine was 43. They had 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, who would grow up understanding that the weight of the crown was coming for them too in time. They had already weathered more as a couple than most families could imagine. Public scrutiny from the first days of their relationship, the pressure of producing an heir, the loss of privacy that is the permanent cost of royal life, and in Catherine's case, a cancer diagnosis that had brought her to the edge of everything and returned her, changed and clearer. They were not going to be a perfect monarchy. No monarchy is. They were going to bring their own tensions, their own blind spots, their own challenges to a role that is inherently impossible. But they were going to bring to it something that Britain genuinely needed. A couple who had faced mortality together, who had rebuilt their strength together, who understood in a deep and personal way what it meant to fight for something that mattered. William serves as heir apparent, a former air ambulance pilot who now works full-time as a senior royal, focusing on environmental causes, mental health awareness, and homelessness. Married to Catherine, he balances the demands of royal duties with raising their 3 children, George, Charlotte, and Louis. These were not abstract commitments. They were the things he had built his public identity around, carefully and deliberately over more than a decade. They were the things he would bring to the throne. Royaltopia. As the summer of 2026 moved forward, the palace remained officially silent on the question of what came next. No announcement had been made. No timeline had been confirmed. Buckingham Palace, true to its nature, was not going to tell the world what it was thinking before it had decided exactly how to say it. But the signs were everywhere for those who knew how to read them. The restructured schedules, the elevated responsibilities, the royal warrant authority, the way that William and Catherine were being positioned in state settings, not as heirs waiting their turn, but as the effective face of the monarchy in the present tense. The conversations that insiders were having, carefully and off the record, about windows and timelines, and the question of how a king who had given everything to his country could give it one final defining thing. The British monarchy has survived everything that history has thrown at it. It has survived conquest and civil war and revolution and scandal and the slow dismantling of empire. It has survived because it has always been willing at the moments that matter most to change. Not quickly, never quickly, but with a deliberateness that eventually arrives at the right decision. And the right decision, in the spring and summer of 2026, was becoming increasingly clear to everyone who was close enough to see it. A king who understood his duty better than almost any monarch in modern history was considering the most profound expression of that duty. The recognition that a crown held too long at too great a cost serves no one, not the nation, not the institution, not even the man wearing it. King Charles III had waited 73 years for the crown. The question that history was now quietly asking was whether, in the tradition of a man who had always understood the difference between what he wanted and what the moment required, he would find the courage to pass it forward, not because he was forced to, not because he was broken, but because he understood, in the way that only a truly great king can understand, that the greatest legacy is not the reign itself. It is what you leave behind when you are gone. William and Catherine were ready. The country was watching, and somewhere inside Buckingham Palace, a king was thinking about the most important decision he had ever made.